When everything falls apart, the first instinct is rarely acceptance. It is resistance. We resist the facts. We resist the ending. We resist the humiliation, the disappointment, the abrupt shift in identity. Something we built or believed in has collapsed. And instead of facing the rubble, we begin negotiating with it. We rewrite the story. We tell ourselves it wasn't that bad. We focus on the highlights reel. We edit out the cracks that were there long before the collapse. Or we do the opposite. We demonize everything, convincing ourselves it was all a lie, because that feels cleaner than holding complexity. But healing does not begin with distortion. It begins with accuracy. To accept that it fell apart is not the same as approving of what happened. It is not resignation. It is not weakness. It is the decision to stop arguing with reality. Psychologically, this is the turning point. Because as long as you are debating the facts, replaying conversations, constructing alternative endings, fantasizing about reversals, you are still emotionally inside the structure that has already crumbled. Acceptance moves you outside of it. It allows you to look at what happened with clarity rather than desperation. And clarity is stabilizing. When something ends abruptly, a relationship, a career, a dream, the nervous system goes into shock. The brain scrambles for coherence. We search for meaning because uncertainty feels intolerable. This is why we obsess, why we replay, why we try to extract one more conversation, one more explanation, one more chance. We believe that if we can fully understand it, we can undo it. But understanding does not reverse collapse. Sometimes it simply confirms it. And this is where grief enters. Grief is not just sadness. It is the emotional process of updating reality. It is the gradual recognition that what was is no longer, that the version of your life you imagined will not unfold in the way you expected. The pain is not only about losing a person or position, it is about losing a future, and the mind resists that loss fiercely. So we rewrite, we romanticize the beginning, we inflate the potential, we tell ourselves that if only we had tried harder, been softer, been smarter, been less demanding, it wouldn't have ended this way. But rewriting the story often becomes a subtle form of self-blame. It keeps you entangled. Acceptance asks something far more courageous. It asks you to look at the relationship or situation as it actually was, not just at its best moments, but in its entirety. What were the patterns? What were the compromises? What were the conversations you avoided? What truths did you sense but silence? This is not about assigning fault with cruelty. It is about reclaiming coherence. Because when everything falls apart, your internal narrative can fracture. You begin to question your perception. You wonder how you missed the signs. You doubt your judgment. Acceptance rebuilds trust in your perception. It allows you to say, this happened, it hurt, and it is real, without embellishment, without minimization. There is a profound dignity in that stance. You do not need to dramatize the collapse to validate your pain, nor do you need to shrink it to appear strong. Strength in this context is the ability to hold the full picture, to say, there were beautiful moments, there were painful patterns, both are true. When you accept that it fell apart, you stop trying to preserve something that no longer exists. You stop waiting for a version of someone to return. You stop bargaining with the past, and this frees up energy. Energy that was previously spent on denial can now be directed toward integration. Integration is different from forgetting. It is the process of placing the experience into your life story without letting it define the entire narrative. You are not the collapse. You are the one who survived it. But survival requires honesty. If you skip this step, if you rush to positivity or revenge or immediate reinvention, the foundation of your healing will be unstable, because you will still be building on distorted ground. Acceptance is the ground. It is quiet, it is often painful. It does not feel triumphant, but it is solid. It allows you to grieve cleanly rather than dramatically, to feel sadness without self-erasure, to acknowledge loss without rewriting history. And from that place, something shifts. You are no longer trying to resurrect what ended. You are beginning to understand why it ended and what that means for you. Healing begins the moment you stop asking, how do I get it back? And start asking, what is this teaching me about what I need next? Let the truth stand. Let the illusion fall. Only then can you rebuild on ground that will not collapse again. After you accept that it fell apart, without distortion, without rewriting, you are left with something even more delicate: identity. Because when a relationship ends, when a career collapses, when a long-held dream disintegrates, it rarely feels like just an external loss. It feels personal. It feels like a verdict. We don't just say, "It failed." We quietly begin to wonder, "Did I fail?" This is the psychological pivot point where pain can either mature into wisdom or calcify into shame. There is a profound difference between experiencing loss and becoming defined by it. But in moments of collapse, that boundary blurs. The mind begins to fuse the event with the self. The breakup becomes proof that you are unlovable. The rejection becomes evidence that you are inadequate. The betrayal becomes confirmation that you are naive. And this is where suffering deepens unnecessarily. Because an event is not an identity. Something ended. That is factual. But what ended is not the same thing as who you are. When everything falls apart, your roles fall apart with it. You are no longer someone's partner, no longer someone's chosen candidate, no longer the version of yourself that existed inside that structure. And roles are powerful. They organize our days. They shape our self-concept. They give us continuity. When the role disappears, the ego panics. It asks, "Who am I now?" And in that vulnerable space, the temptation is to assign blame inward. It feels cleaner, more controllable. If it was my fault, then at least I can fix myself and prevent it from happening again. But not every ending is a reflection of deficiency. Some endings are reflections of misalignment, of incompatibility, of timing, of growth in different directions. When you internalize every collapse as proof of personal inadequacy, you create a fragile identity, one that depends on outcomes for validation. Healing requires separating what happened from what it means about you. This is not about avoiding responsibility. If there are patterns that contributed to the fall, they deserve examination. Self-reflection is part of growth, but self-reflection is not self-condemnation. There is a difference between saying, "I need to grow," and saying, "I am fundamentally flawed." One leads to evolution, the other leads to erosion. Psychologically, shame is sticky. It attaches to the core of identity. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "I am wrong." And after everything falls apart, shame can seep in quietly. It can disguise itself as humility or accountability. But shame does not build resilience. It fractures it. To heal, you must disentangle your worth from the outcome. Your worth is inherent. It is not upgraded by success nor downgraded by loss. But we live in cultures, and often in families, where achievement, stability, and relationship status become proxies for value. So when those structures collapse, it feels like our value collapses with them. This is an illusion. A relationship ending does not mean you are incapable of love. It means that particular dynamic could not sustain itself. A professional failure does not mean you are incompetent. It means that attempt did not succeed under those conditions. When you begin to see events as contextual rather than existential, something softens. You stop defending your identity against every setback. You become more curious and less self-punishing. And curiosity is fertile ground for healing. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you begin to ask, "What does this reveal about what fits me and what doesn't?" You start to examine compatibility instead of character assassination. You explore patterns without collapsing into them. This shift protects your core. Because here is the danger. When identity fuses with loss, you shrink. You hesitate to try again. You enter future relationships guarded not from wisdom but from fear. You downplay your desires because you no longer trust your judgment. But the fall does not invalidate your capacity. It refines it. It teaches you what you overlooked, what you tolerated, what you need more of, what you will no longer accept. And this information is empowering if you do not use it to attack yourself. Healing after collapse means allowing your identity to be larger than the event, more complex than the outcome, more enduring than the role you lost. You are not just the partner who was left. You are not just the professional who was rejected. You are not just the person who misjudged. You are a whole human being in motion, evolving, learning, recalibrating. When you separate the loss from your identity, you reclaim authorship. The event becomes a chapter, not the title of your life, and that distinction matters Because if you believe the collapse defines you, you will unconsciously recreate its emotional landscape. You will choose from fear. You will operate from scarcity. You will seek validation rather than alignment. But if you see the collapse as an experience, not a verdict, you remain intact, bruised perhaps, humbled certainly, but intact. And from that intact place, you can rebuild with intention rather than desperation. Everything fell apart, but you did not. And the moment you stop confusing what ended with who you are, you begin to rise from it, stronger, clearer, and more self-aware than before. And after acceptance, after separating the loss from your identity, after reclaiming the parts of you that shrank to survive, there is one final and essential movement in healing. You rebuild. But how you rebuild determines whether the collapse becomes a turning point or a repetition. When everything falls apart, urgency rushes in. There is an almost primal desire to restore equilibrium, to fill the silence, to replace what was lost, to prove to yourself and perhaps to others that you are still desirable, still capable, still intact. Urgency feels productive. It feels like strength, but often it is avoidance in disguise. If you rebuild from urgency, you rebuild from fear. You choose quickly to escape discomfort. You attach quickly to avoid loneliness. You overcommit to avoid uncertainty. And without realizing it, you recreate familiar structures. Not because they are aligned, but because they are known. Healing asks for something far more disciplined. It asks for intention. Intention is slower. It is reflective. It tolerates ambiguity. It allows the dust to settle before laying a new foundation. This is uncomfortable because once the noise of crisis fades, you are left with space. And space can feel disorienting. You may not immediately know who you are outside the roles you lost. You may not know what you want without the pressures that once defined you. But this space is not emptiness. It is possibility. Rebuilding with intention begins with asking different questions. Not, how do I get back to where I was? But, what did where I was teach me? Not, who will choose me next? But, who aligns with the person I am becoming? When you slow down enough to reflect, patterns become visible. You begin to see what attracted you to certain dynamics, what you tolerated, what energized you, what depleted you. This awareness becomes architectural. You start designing your next chapter with discernment rather than desperation. In relationships, this might mean choosing someone not because they generate intensity, but because they generate stability. Not because they validate your wounds, but because they respect your boundaries. It might mean pacing intimacy instead of rushing toward fusion. In work, it might mean pursuing roles that align with your values rather than chasing titles that temporarily soothe your ego. It might mean redefining success in ways that protect your well-being rather than erode it. Intentional rebuilding is not about constructing a perfect life. It is about constructing a coherent one. Coherence means your external structures reflect your internal growth. After everything falls apart, there is often a temptation to overcorrect, to become hyper-independent, hyper-guarded, to build walls so high that nothing can destabilize you again. But protection is not the same as healing. If you rebuild from defensiveness, you may avoid collapse, but you will also avoid connection. The goal is not invulnerability. The goal is resilience. Resilience means you can engage deeply without losing yourself. It means you can love without self-erasure. It means you can commit without abandoning discernment. And resilience requires patience. There is wisdom in allowing a period of deliberate reconstruction, in resisting the cultural pressure to move on quickly, in honoring the fact that integration takes time. When you rebuild with intention, you become more selective, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You no longer say yes to dynamics that require you to shrink. You no longer pursue paths that demand chronic self-sacrifice. You no longer confuse chaos with chemistry. Instead, you choose environments, relational and professional, that allow you to expand. And here is the paradox. When you are no longer rebuilding to prove something, you begin building something more authentic. Your choices become less reactive, less performative, more aligned. You are not trying to replace what was lost. You are creating something new. Everything fell apart. But that does not mean everything was meant to be restored. Some collapses are demolitions, clearing unstable structures so something stronger can be built. The pain was real. The grief was real. But so is the opportunity embedded within it. The opportunity to design your life with consciousness, to choose partnerships that feel secure rather than addictive, to pursue ambitions that feel meaningful rather than impressive, to live in a way that reflects who you have become, not who you were trying to be. Rebuilding with intention is an act of quiet power. It says, I will not rush to escape discomfort. I will not rebuild on unstable ground. Once you've accepted that it fell apart, and once you've separated the loss from your identity, a more intimate layer of healing begins. You start to notice that the collapse didn't begin at the moment of impact. It began in the quiet compromises. Long before everything visibly fell apart, parts of you were already shrinking. You adjusted your tone to avoid conflict. You silenced concerns because you didn't want to seem difficult. You overextended, overperformed, overaccommodated. You told yourself it was maturity, flexibility, love. Sometimes it was, but sometimes it was survival. In many relationships, romantic, professional, even familial, we adapt in subtle ways to maintain stability. This is human. We are relational beings. We calibrate to each other. But healing requires asking a more uncomfortable question. At what point did adaptation become self-abandonment? When everything collapses, it exposes not only the failure of the structure, but the quiet negotiations you made inside it. The moments you ignored your intuition, the boundaries you blurred, the needs you postponed indefinitely. These are not indictments, they are insights. Often, the most painful realization is not that someone hurt you, it's that you participated in your own diminishment, not intentionally, not maliciously, but incrementally. You told yourself, it's not a big deal. You told yourself, this is just how relationships work. You told yourself, I can handle it. And you could, until you couldn't. Reclaiming the parts of you that shrunk to survive is not about blaming yourself for the collapse. It is about restoring internal alignment. When you consistently override your instincts to preserve connection, you fracture self-trust. You begin to doubt your perceptions. You hesitate before speaking. You feel subtly anxious, but can't always articulate why. That anxiety is often the sound of the self being muted. Healing asks you to turn the volume back up, to revisit those moments, not to shame yourself, but to understand what they were protecting you from. Conflict, rejection, abandonment, failure. When you identify the fear beneath the compromise, you begin to understand the pattern. Perhaps you learned early that love requires accommodation, that harmony is more important than honesty, that your needs are excessive. These narratives do not originate in adulthood, they are often rehearsed long before. So when you find yourself shrinking in a relationship, it can feel familiar, almost normal, until it becomes unsustainable. The collapse, painful as it is, becomes revelatory. It shows you where you disappeared. And this is where the work deepens. Reclaiming yourself is not dramatic. It is deliberate. It is the practice of listening again to the instincts you muted. It is rebuilding boundaries not as walls, but as expressions of clarity. It may feel uncomfortable at first. When you begin speaking more directly, you might fear being perceived as difficult. When you assert a boundary, you might anticipate rejection. When you express a need without apology, you may feel exposed. That discomfort is not regression. It is recalibration. You are stretching muscles that have been underused. There is a profound shift that happens when you stop prioritizing the preservation of the relationship over the preservation of yourself. You begin to notice how much energy was spent managing perception, how much thought went into not rocking the boat, how often you preemptively adjusted to avoid disapproval. When you reclaim yourself, that energy returns. You feel more coherent, less fragmented. Decisions become clearer because they are no longer filtered solely through, will this keep them? Instead, the question becomes, does this keep me? This is not selfishness, it is integration. A relationship should not require the erasure of your core traits. It should not demand chronic self-silencing. Growth may require compromise, but compromise should be mutual, not one-sided. If you had to become smaller to maintain stability, then the stability was conditional, and conditional stability is fragile. Healing means you no longer confuse self-erasure with love. You begin to practice micro-courage, saying the small truth, holding the small boundary, allowing someone to be disappointed rather than betraying yourself to avoid it. Each of these acts rebuilds self-trust, and self-trust is the foundation of future resilience. Because when you trust yourself, you no longer fear collapse in the same way. You know that even if something ends, you will not abandon yourself inside it. Everything fell apart. But perhaps what truly fell apart was the version of you that believed shrinking was necessary to be chosen. As you move forward, let this be the quiet commitment you carry. Never trade your voice for temporary stability. Reclaim the parts of you that went silent, because the life you rebuild must have room for your full presence, not just the version of you that survives, but the version that stands whole. I will not repeat what I have finally understood, and that is how collapse transforms into growth. Everything fell apart. Now you get to decide, slowly, deliberately, courageously, what will rise in its place.